Right, well, it's 1900 now, virtually here in the UK, and we may as well start the meeting. Martin Ratcliffe was, I only knew him for a few weeks, but I came into the Reading area just around about the mid-80s time when he left. And subsequently he's had a professional career in astronomy, not only academic, but as being a manager of a company that installs and trains people in seriously major planetarium installations around the world. So thank you very much, Martin. I'll leave it to you. Go ahead.
Great. Well, I've been looking forward to this all week, and this is a great honor and thrill to be back talking to folks in Reading, because it's a long time since I was there. You probably noticed that my Berkshire accent has worn off a little bit, so apologies for that. So let's get right started, because I have a lot of pictures to go through. So what I'm going to do is share my screen and do that. And okay. And this might take a moment just to propagate through the internet airwaves. So maybe somebody can let me know, just a verbal, yes, you can all see that. Everybody see that and hear me?
Yep.
Okay, great.
Yes.
Yep. Got it.
It's saying my connection is unstable, but we'll see how we go. Just anybody pause me, stop me at any time. So,
can I just suggest that people put themselves on mute?
Oh, and I should do
so
that.
We don't get any background, or unless you want to do it, Martin, from your end.
Let me see, mute. Gee, I can't find it. Maybe just ask everybody to mute.
Yeah, everyone should be able to do it. It's usually on the lower left-hand side of your screen, next to a microphone.
I've got it on the top right of my icon.
Ah.
And I'm muting now.
Yep, great. Okay. So we'll get started. And as I say, it's wonderful to be doing this. I grew up in Reading Astronomical Society. I joined, I think it was 1975. It may have been 1974. I lived in Newbury. And Reading Astronomical Society held a big exhibition in that 74-75 period. Patrick Moore opened it. I was, of course, an avid watcher of the sky at night. I didn't know much else, didn't know anyone in astronomy. And so I went to that meeting on one Saturday afternoon, got enthralled with all the people in the club, and joined. So my dear mother would drive me to Reading every Saturday, drop me off at Muriel Wrigley's house. Muriel would give me tea and talk about things that were happening, and then we'd walk down to the church hall and in early, and we'd enjoy the meetings. And there are lots of people who I vividly remember. Of course, Anthony Thomas, who will probably, hopefully, either is online or will see the recording of this. Jim Betts, Frank Gear, Charles Wise, Jeff Amory, lots of names from the past. I almost wanted to dig out old photographs, but I didn't do too much of that. I've got one or two. So in Newbury, I built a roll-off roof observatory, and as you can tell, we don't build them like that anymore. It was a very rickety thing. What had happened was that when I was in the school in Newbury, a friend, Tim Abernethy, and I decided to build an 8.75-inch reflecting telescope. We were going to grind our own mirror, and the school had a disused shed, so they allowed us, fourth-year students, fourth-year pupils, to use the shed on our own, on the school grounds, as a mirror grinding lab. And we spent a year and a half doing that. I eventually left the school, and eventually got the mirror finished by Henry Wilde, who did the fine grinding and parabolizing. And then I needed a shed to put the telescope in. And so I asked the school, since it was pretty much derelict, could I have it? And they said yes. So I drove a truck up to the house and put this in there. So I spent many a night out here observing with the 8 3/4 inch, and that's really how I got my observing start. And of course, visiting the Reading Astronomical Society every month. There are many other people, I know one or two maybe still around, Tim Hames, who we did lots of occultations, lunar occultations with. And we had Jeff Amory, who is the lunar section director of the BAA. So I was really learning a lot from these people, and that was one of the wonderful things about an excellent astronomy society like Reading, is that you learn a lot. So I have a lot of stuff to get into, so I could probably do a whole talk on reminiscing, but I'm not going to do that. But before I do, I'll show a couple of photographs. On the left here, you'll see Lee McDonald, who is now Dr. Lee McDonald. And on the right, you'll see the tall figure of Anthony Thomas. Next to him is Tony Cook, who is a lunar observer, and Marie Cook, his wife. And Tony's sadly no longer with us, but his wife, we still share Christmas cards, as I do with Anthony. Anthony and I started up Rastar, which was the Reading Astronomical Society newsletter, and this comes through terribly on the video, but I have the copy here, and I thought this would be an interesting flashback. So the top copy is the 1984 edition. And it was a 12-page special. We usually did 10 pages. And this was a newsletter that we put together on an old carbon copy. We had to type it out with carbon copy paper, and then we put the paper on a duplicator and hand crank every single page. And so on my way home from work in near Reading, I would drive by Anthony's house on the A4. He was a teacher at Elstree School. And if we wanted to meet, he was often selling tomatoes or produce from his garden. But sometimes the sign outside would say, Martin. And that would be the indication for me to stop and come and visit. So we would have impromptu meetings, which was a great deal of fun and some fun memories of that time. Of course, I was heavily involved with the BAA. I was on council for a few years. I was secretary of, I think, the 2nd or 3rd National Astronomy Week back in the early 1980s. And I dug this out the other day. This was the centenary of the BAA in 1990. And at that meeting, we had a number of people sign this. The coat of arms was new, had been introduced and funded by an American amateur called Ben Mayer, who his signature is on the left. But you may recognize some of the names on there. Many are still with us, and many, sadly, are not. So it's an interesting, one of those kind of memorabilia, I suppose, that has a lot of famous and infamous names on there. Well, I've always been interested in astronomical photography, so I thought, well, why not show one of my first best photos of the Pleiades? I mounted a Zenith E camera, piggyback on a 4-inch Cooke refractor, which I still have. And this was a photo of the Pleiades, and the Hyades trailed, of course. I was supposed to be tracking it, so I don't know why it trailed. But those were early days. I was probably 14 when I took this photo. Didn't really know what I was doing. Things have improved a bit in my photography. Last night, we had Venus, of course, near the Pleiades. And so I took this shot over the roof of the house It's a little bit better than the last one, but there's, I don't know, 50 years, 45 years of experience gone in there. This is the roof of our house, this brown shadow at the lower right. And so you can see Venus was getting very close to there. And I have always wanted to try and do diffraction spikes. I've taken lots and lots of photographs of Venus in a star field without diffraction spikes. And I thought, let's give it a try. So I want to show you my diffraction spike, that's very hard to say, diffraction spike generator. So here we go, you ready? Drum roll. Here it is. Handmade diffraction spike generator, one strip of cardboard, one strip of felt or adhesive foam on the inside. This wraps around the 85mm f2 lens that I was using, and a couple of pieces of wire, just 1 or 2 millimeters thick. Strap that across the front, drop that on there, rotate it to make sure the orientation of the diffraction spikes are what you want, and fire away. And that's the kind of photograph you can get. I have a photograph at the end, which I'll show you, of the comet that I took last night as well, and I left the diffraction spike thing on. So it's pretty. May not be real, but it is artistic, which is part of the reason we take photographs, right? Not always scientific. A little bit of background history. I went to UCL in London to do an astronomy degree after working for 5 years in a chemistry lab, and eventually was very lucky to have a job at the Armagh Planetarium in Northern Ireland, and got use of this telescope, a 10-inch grub refractor. I should mention in passing that while we're a member of Reading back in the 1970s, we had use of an 8-inch refractor at Bradfield College. There was also one at Wellington College that I know Steve Turner used, and I think Steve's online somewhere. So when I came to here, a 10-inch refractor, I was used to using an instrument like this after Bradfield's experience. So this is pretty straightforward to use. Had a falling weight clock drive, but this had an enormous depth of history because J.L.E. Dreyer had used it in the late 1800s when he worked in Armagh at the observatory, and he completed the notes of the new general catalog using this telescope. I'm going to reflect back on that telescope in a moment. Armagh was a real fantastic beginning to my planetarium career. You can see some of the well-known people we had come and visit. This was the bicentenary of the Armagh Observatory. The post office issued new stamps. Had a BAA meeting, so there's Patrick at the bottom and John Mason, and I'm espousing something I don't know what. Nigel Hembest and Ian Ridpath are there, and of course I closed my eyes for some photographs, who knows why. And of course dear Heather, who we lost earlier this year, sadly. She was an occasional visitor over to Armagh. So my Armagh Planetarium training in presenting shows and talking about the night sky pretty much every day led to an exciting phone call from John Mason, who said that Patrick had been writing the astronomy night sky column for Astronomy Now for years and just wanted to hand it off to somebody else, and would I be interested? It turned out, you know, if you'd asked me 10 years ago, before that, I would never have believed that I would have been asked such a question, but there's nothing like preparation to prepare yourself for openings. And in this case, I was pretty well prepared for doing that. And so I wrote for the magazine Astronomy Now for a number of years before I moved to America. And since that time, I've been writing for Astronomy magazine, which some of you may read, although it's not as popular. There's so many magazines around now. But I've been doing astronomy night sky column for 22 years now, every month. And one of the interesting things I reflected upon, and I didn't really seriously think about at the time, is I still have a folder of newspaper clippings from the Guardian newspaper. And on the back page, Alan Pickup used to write a monthly column about the night sky and told what satellites were coming over. And I remember keeping those clippings because I said, you know, one day I might like to write something like that. And it's funny now that I've been doing it as a career that I think I really had some early inspiration and stuck to it. I picked out this funny photograph. During that centenary meeting, the Armagh Planetarium got a bit of advertising with the local bus company, and we had a whole bus painted. And John Mason and I'm not sure what we're doing here, whether I kind of bunked him in the stomach or he was laughing or he'd fallen. I thought it was funny. Here we are in full gear, getting ready to announce the arrival of this bus for the planetarium. I'm going to jump around a bit now. I was in Armagh for 6 or 7 years. It was absolutely magnificent time. And I'll go back to that when I talk about comets. But in 1991, I got the offer of a job to lead the planetarium at the Carnegie Science Center in Pittsburgh in Pennsylvania. This is a very large museum system. So I went from one of the smallest observatories and planetariums, but a planetarium that was very technologically advanced for its day, to one of the largest museum systems in America. It's second in size to the Smithsonian. There's a history museum, there's an art museum. It's enormous in various different places in Pittsburgh. So here you see me on the roof with a hard hat. We were going to be positioning a 16-inch rooftop observatory here. And this was my boss. This was a fantastic German scientist who worked for Westinghouse and was an advisor on all of our projects. So Carnegie Science Center really brought me into a very large planetarium community. You know, at the time, about 6 or 7 planetariums in the UK, and there were over 300 or 400 in the United States. And the feeling of camaraderie and friendship and sharing between all the planetariums. We used to have annual meetings. I really got to know everybody very well, and it was a thrill. After being there for 6 or 7 years, in 1997, I got the opportunity to move to Wichita, Kansas. And like everybody, I said, where? Where is that? And once I arrived here, I realized, wow, it's a little jewel hidden away in the Midwest, because it's an aviation center, as Jerry already mentioned. There's Cessna, Boeing, Learjet, Raytheon. Used to have the Stearman aircraft, for those who are interested in history of aircraft. This was the place they built planes to test back in the 1920s and 30s. And an amazing history to aviation. But it's also surrounded by a farming community. And they really had no large science center, and they decided to build a big one. This was a $65 million project. If there are any architects online, you may have heard the name Moshe Safdie. He's the architect who designed this. This year he won the Building of the Year award for an airport in China. He didn't build it this year, he built it a few years, last year, I believe it. So it's a very big project. We had some of the leaders of the early aviation period on our board. Marilyn Beach of Beechcraft was one of them. Velma Wallace, whose husband, Dwayne Wallace, owned Cessna aircraft. And they were the people who we were rubbing shoulders with in building this magnificent project. And so I ran the planetarium there for about 6 or 7 years. It was a 60-foot diameter planetarium dome. And we had a nice collection of staff, and this is what I did every day. So I'll jump ahead. My slides are not in kind of fully descriptive order because I want to get to some observational astronomy in a little bit. But after leaving Exploration Place in 2005, I joined Skyscan, which is a commercial company that built planetariums all over the world. And my job was training on site, which meant wherever we built a planetarium, I would go. I love traveling, always have, and I love astronomy. And so a lot of these places would take me to some remarkable areas that I had never been before. And my favorite is, well, I got two favorites, is Cape Town. Cape Town, South Africa has a fantastic astronomical heritage. The observatory in Cape Town, the Royal Observatory, is celebrating 200 years this year, I believe. Or the South African Astronomical Observatory is 200 years old. Here's Table Mountain. I've been to visit South Africa probably 7 or 8 times in the last decade related to this project and others. And here is the planetarium dome. The gardens here are the original government gardens that came up from the harbor, which is way off to the upper left. And these were called the government gardens. They were laid out by the UK government at the time when this was a colony. And one of the fascinating stories here, and I can only imagine who the conversations going on in this park as people walked through, because one of the residents here in the 1830s was John Herschel. He'd brought his 20-foot telescope down to a region, if you look over, see if I can get my mouse going, oops. If you look over this hill, around the corner, a few miles away, is the location of John Herschel's telescope and observatory. That's where he observed from. But he also lived in this town when HMS Beagle docked on its way back from the Galapagos, and Charles Darwin was on board and met with John Herschel. So I just want to imagine sitting down for coffee one afternoon in this park with John Herschel and Charles Darwin and just listen to their conversation. How amazing would that be? So I've become quite passionate about reading and learning about John Herschel since then. I've visited a library in Austin, Texas, which has his original notes in his notebook, little handwritten notes. And I've gone through some of those pages, and it's just magnificent to read through that. Anyway, jumping ahead, that's one place that is close to my heart. But now I want to get to observing comets or observations. So this is the astronomy part. I have a passion for comets and eclipses. So I'm going to talk about those two for a little while. So comets have always been of interest to me because, of course, I grew up in an age when everybody was looking forward to 1986 and the magnificent return of Halley's Comet. Well, it wasn't quite that magnificent visually, but it was a magnificent comet. And one of the jobs I had at Armagh Planetarium was helping run a Halley's Comet Roadshow in Northern Ireland. And this was my first 4 months of work. I visited probably 50 schools. We did a roadshow every night of the week. And we're in a different school and talked about observing the comet. And if it was clear, we would go out and see the comet when it was in Taurus and that kind of thing. This is my personal notebook. The front, I made a special notebook, which is one of my precious, precious things that I have. And So I used the 10-inch Grubb refractor at Armagh to observe Halley. And the first time I saw it was October 6, 1985. Here I have, I was observing the fading of our corona borealis and also Jupiter, but after midnight I moved to the area of Halley. Now I tried a month before and couldn't, no, I tried the night before and I could not see it. And a good friend in Northern Ireland, Terry Mosley, did see it with a 14-inch. So he was the first person in Ireland to see the return of Halley. I was the second. But that didn't worry me at all. I was not surprised the 14-inch beat a 10-inch, right? But I was determined to see it with his telescope because I have a strong affinity for connecting to the history of astronomy. Just personally, I love being in a similar place to how previous people have been. And so you'll see my little sketch of the location of the comet. There's various notations I made, but my probably one and only claim to fame, and it won't last for long, is this was the first observation through this refractor of Halley's Comet since 1910, when J.L.E. Dreyer last observed it. So Dreyer of NGC fame used this same telescope to see Halley, and it was tremendously exciting to be the next person to recover it with that telescope. Part of my planetarium job was to travel to Kenya and Australia to photograph the comet during March and April. And in fact, Anthony Thomas from Reading came with us on the trip to Australia. He and I had a magnificent trip with the planetarium team. And then he and I went off to New Zealand for a week for a magnificent tour of New Zealand, just the two of us. And we saw the total eclipse of the moon in late April from Queensland in the South Island of New Zealand. And that was a magical night because the comet wasn't visible when the moon was full, but as the eclipse progressed, you saw the comet and its tail gradually appear. And in the middle of totality, the tail of Halley was quite clearly visible in the sky. And then after totality, it faded away again. And that was our last best view of Halley. But this was probably certainly my best photograph of Halley, or certainly one of my favorites. It landed on the front cover of the BAA journal at the time. It shows Halley, which is in our solar system. It shows stars, which are in our Milky Way. It shows a globular cluster, Omega Centauri, which is orbiting the Milky Way. And it shows Centaurus A, a distant galaxy. So this is really like looking through a straw through space into the depths of space all along one line. And you have a comet, stars, globular cluster, and galaxy all in one shot. This was taken from just below the Anglo-Australian telescope. We were camping in the park in Australia, in Coonabarabran. Sometimes when you're using I was using a Schmidt camera, and you can make a mistake by forgetting that you took the film out, you forgot to remove the chip of film, and you think you put another one in and you put it back in the camera and you ended up taking a double exposure. So I made a note of this. I was very surprised the next morning. I must have been really sleepy when I took the photo because obviously made a mistake. But I like my little notation of north, north, and then question mark. So I flipped the image. Here's a photograph taken by, he was the director of the planetarium at the time, Terence Murtaugh, of Halley's Comet. Above our observing team, this is Anthony Thomas on the left. This is me using the Schmidt camera mounted piggyback on a C8. And then Ian McKinley, who was a technician at the planetarium. And I have just noticed, I'd never noticed this before, but these are my 20 by 80 binoculars that I bought off a Reading member. And I can't quite remember his name, but I think his last name was Davies. And when I moved to America, these binoculars and a set of speakers were the only things not listed on our removal gear. When we moved to North America, And when we unpacked everything, the speakers and the binoculars were missing. So that was tragic, but I've since replaced the binoculars, of course. This is a photo of me near, I've forgotten the name of this flat top mountain here, but it's near, those of you who've been to Australia, it's not far from Alice Springs, and it's quite close to the meteor impact area. And one night we saw a bunch of ants crawling across the ground here, up the tripod leg, across here and down the other side, and then straight over here. That was an interesting night. But you just keep on photographing, right? You don't worry about the wildlife. And this is the Schmidt camera, which I still have downstairs, but haven't used in a while. But I used it for a lot of comet photography. Nowadays, I use a Celestron C14 in my roll-off roof shed. This is my current location. This is my neighbor's house. I've forgotten which comet this is. I didn't really worry about looking it up, but it's a photograph of a comet from a number of years ago. So I thought now I'd just dive into some other comet observations and photographs that I'd done. Comet Hale-Bopp, of course, is the great one. On the left is a photograph through a C11 that I owned at the time. But the right-hand two photographs are taken with the same Schmidt camera that I used for Halley. And I want you to consider this. If I go back to Halley, look at the size of the comet in this region. And I think Halley was a few dozen million miles away, maybe a dozen million miles away. Hale-Bopp was 60 million miles away, much, much further away than Halley, yet it was still a much larger comet in the same camera system. So this was a huge, huge comet. It looked large in the sky, but it was also physically very large because it was large in our sky, even though it was very far away, almost as far away, not quite, about 2/3 of the way to the sun. So it was a beautiful comet. We haven't had one like this since. One or two have come close, actually, but not necessarily in the northern hemisphere. Of course, well, I will mention a little aside as well. I got to meet Tom Bopp. He lived in Phoenix, Arizona, and so he and I met. I invited him up to the Carnegie Science Center to give a talk. And he saw my black painted 4-inch Cook refractor and said, you know, my dad and I could refurbish that for you. And so he took it away and spent 3 years with his dad. His dad was a master jeweler, Frank. And so Frank and Tom refurbished this telescope to an absolute jewel of a telescope. And my jaw drops the fact that that even happened. I felt very, very lucky to be in that situation. Of course, another comet, Comet Hyakutake. This was also a photograph on the left taken through the same Schmidt camera. And so I like comparing my 3 photographs of Halley, Hyakutake, and Hale-Bopp, all taken with the same camera. So this was in April when it was in Perseus. This was earlier. This was in March when it was not far from the pole star, and you can see this extremely thin, fine blue tail extending way off here. I did lots of photography of Hyakutake. Other comets that have been around, Comet Holmes, of course, was a really peculiar one. This is a photograph just taken with a regular camera lens. I think it was a 80mm lens. Here's the infamous Comet Ison before it vaporized in 2013. We were very excited that that was going to be a bright daylight comet, and it fizzled. That gives you an idea of what you can do. Here's last night's photo. This is from last night with a SV, a Stellarvue 80mm Canon 6D, 18 × 92nd exposure. It was 3 degrees north of this galaxy, NGC 2304. And here's the comet. So this is just a straight, and I did have my diffraction spike generator on there, as you can see. So I processed this morning hurriedly to get it for you. There's still a bit of vignetting in here, but yeah, it turned out rather nice. And this comet is starting to look quite good. It's still 8th magnitude. We've got a long way to go. Comets tend to brighten a little bit when they're out near the orbit of Jupiter and Mars, if they're new comets, because they're very volatile gases, come off quite early after they cross the orbit of Jupiter. But if they boil away and there's nothing left, they can fade a little bit after crossing the orbit of Mars. So it may not follow the brightening that we're all hoping for, but it may. And as David Levy, famous comet astronomer, often says, comets are like cats. They're going to do what they like, and we have no control over it. But it's certainly worth keeping an eye on. I'm going to move on to eclipses now. I did a number of eclipses. My first was in Kenya in whatever year that was, 80, I think. I know many members of the Reading Astronomical Society went on the Monte Umbe expedition in 1973, and I was tremendously envious as a 13 or 14-year-old that I couldn't go on a cruise ship. But it did whet my appetite for going to eclipses, and I've been traveling to them, a few of them ever since. This is a photograph with my 6-inch Maxitoff, which I now no longer own. And a Canon G5 attached to it. And here you see a photograph of the diamond ring on the picture. There's a funny story here. This, at the time, was my lady friend, Sean. And she was very excited that this trip to Greece, which was our first trip together, might result in an engagement. And so when I'd finished the photography, she just sort of was very good at leaving me alone to focus on the photography. But after the eclipse, I said, "Come and see the diamond ring." And she went, "Ooh, ooh, ooh." And I said, "Here it is. There's the photograph. Isn't it nice?" And she said, "Oh, yeah, really good, Martin." What she didn't know was that my camera bag, my telescope bag, had an eyepiece box in it, and packed inside the eyepiece box was a real diamond ring. And so after the eclipse, we went back to the room, and I said, "By the way, I think we should get married," and presented her with a ring. And her first question was, "Where did you hide that?" And I said, "You carried it all the way to Greece." So that was fun. So she's still here, and we're very happy over here. So that's my wife, Sean. This is one of the photographs I took through that telescope. So normally they say, you know, you should start your photography of eclipses with a fairly wide angle. Well, I'd done a couple of wide angle eclipses. Anthony Thomas and I had gone with the BAA to Hawaii and saw that eclipse. But this time I wanted to get really close up. And what was stunning was, as the diamond ring progressed, I got to the point where I could remove the solar filter. And there, sitting right on top of the diamond ring, was a huge prominence. I could not believe my luck. Does somebody have a question or a comment?
I'll turn the picture off.
Okay, I think somebody has a microphone on. So, anyway, that was amazing. And this was a shot of the diamond ring as well, because everybody likes photographs of the diamond ring. 2017, we had an eclipse in the US. Many of you I know, or some of you certainly came over for that. I know Jerry did and has talked to you about the eclipse before. This was the first eclipse I could drive to. It's a 10-hour drive from where I live. So that's not bad for the Midwest. But I loved this cartoon. In case you can't read it over the internet, it says, "Hey neighbor, are you moving? Did she kick you out? Haha." He says, "No, eclipse chasing by car." Maybe, and his wife is saying, maybe we should have rented a truck. And notice all the gear here. It's a camera, tools, eyepieces, filters, counterweight, tripod. Notice no clothes. So here's my gear ready to go to the eclipse. Notice 2 telescopes, tripod, camera bag, computer bag, eyepiece bag, more cameras, and I think I squashed some clothes into the red one. So it's real. So this was our site at Casper, Wyoming. And I'll just point out the gear that I was using. It was nice to be able to take a decent telescope with me that I usually cannot put on a plane. This is a 4-inch Teleview that I used with a Canon camera on the back, an Ioptron EQ45 mount. This is my buddy Mike Murray from another planetarium in Michigan. And this was his first eclipse. And over here we have, there's a remarkable story here. This is Stacy Palin and her husband John, who are both physics professors in Utah. And this is Shane Larson, who is a gravitational wave astronomer from Northwestern University. And what we did not know at the time, and he had to keep quiet, was that they had detected the first the first gravitational wave detection. I forget exactly what it was. Oh no, it was the neutron star merger. It was a neutron star merger, and he knew about it, and he couldn't tell anyone. He was sworn to secrecy. And we realized in October, when they announced the neutron merger news, which is just a spectacular discovery, that I sent him a note and I said, "Hey, you kept that quiet." And he said, "It's not every month that a solar eclipse is the second most amazing astronomical event of your career." Not the first. So that was amazing. Anyway, a few little photographs of this eclipse. This was my first trial at really doing some HDR processing. This is a fairly quick version. You can see some of the plumes here. It's not a, I mean, I like the photograph, but these days I think I can improve a little bit. Here's a close-up of the diamond ring. I was probably a half a second too late in taking this shot because the diamond ring was very bright, but you could still see the prominences on the edge. And then I did a wide-angle set of eclipse shots. This was also the first time I tried this, shooting the entire partial phase and totality. This totality was not through the camera. This is actually through the 4-inch telescope. So that's a montage placed on top. And then probably my favorite montage was this one. This took hours and hours. But I have the 2 diamond rings with the totality kind of montage on the top. So that was my goal, was to get very sharp photographs and create some kind of spectacular montage. And I was really thrilled with that. And so one day I'll go back and do some more processing if I can stop taking new photographs all the time. Then came Elqui Valley, and we were going to go to Chile anyway for the eclipse. And then I got invited by the Boston Museum of Science. I knew their planetarium director well. And she had been asked, you know, we have a very large contingent. You might want to have somebody else who can talk astronomy. And so she asked me if I'd be interested in going. And I said, sure. Better believe it, I think, or something like that. Hell yes. And so this was our campsite. And I can tell you it was dry, high, very cold. It literally felt like we were on Mars, as you can tell, apart from the trees. And it was an absolutely spectacular, crystal clear blue sky. It's the first eclipse I've been to in, 25 years, where there've been no clouds at all. And so I knew we're on a good thing for the photography. This was the whole team. Here's my camera rig. This time it's the Stellarvue 80mm, which is a Rode. I can carry that on a plane. And this was the team of people that we had there. Just by coincidence, the same travel group had organized Nigel Henbest and the, what's the name of the astronauts group with Virgin Galactic were in the next campground up here. So I met Nigel down in the village as we arrived. Here's sort of a middle of eclipse shot from an automated camera that I had going with a 14mm lens. Really clear, pristine, clear blue skies. And here's a shot, again, another attempt at an HDR that I did for the museum. And so they distributed this to all of the people who were at the eclipse. Across the valley were a couple of observatories. This is Tololo Observatory. It's 12 miles away from where I took this photo. I used the Stellarvue 80mm, and this photo tells you two things. One is the optics of that telescope are absolutely superb. There's no chromatic aberration. And the other is that the valley has incredibly clear, steady air, which is why they put big telescopes there, of course. And the funny thing was, on the original, I can see people here, and in fact, I know one or two of them. So this whole ridge here was thronged with observers for the eclipse. So that was a special addition to the things you see. Of course, the Milky Way and Jupiter was up. This was our campground at night. Somebody with a torch came jogging by during the picture. This was the Virgin Galactic party tent. There was loud music coming out of that tent and smoke. I'm not sure what that was. I think they had a campfire outside. But perhaps my favorite photograph of the nighttime, aside from the eclipse, was this one, showing the Milky Way above my tent, which is this one. Sean is actually inside there, trying to warm up. There's large Magellanic Cloud, small Magellanic Cloud, Eta Carina, the Coalsack, the Southern Cross right here, Alpha and Beta Centauri, and lots and lots of amazing things in the night sky. Okay, so I better truck along because I see time is rolling along. So wanted to talk about other astrophotography that I do. And one of the other places I like in South Africa that I've gone to visit is in Bloemfontein. And Bloemfontein had a large old observatory. Not this one, there's another one on Naval Hill, which had a 28-inch refractor. It was long since dismantled, and they converted that to a planetarium, and I got to go and teach the staff there. They became very good friends. And in the year before the Mars big opposition 2 years ago, I was writing my astronomy column, and I was writing about the perihelic opposition of Mars. And I thought, you know, I've always wanted to go to the southern hemisphere to see Mars at a perihelic opposition because Mars is overhead. I wonder where I could go. And I realized, I thought, wait a minute, I know the director of the Boyden Observatory, they have a 13-inch Clark refractor. So I immediately sent him an email saying, hey, could I come down and use that telescope for the Mars opposition? Within an hour, he'd written back saying, sure. Well, that was easy. And again, I pinch myself when I tell this story because I can't believe I did it. But I paid myself to do this trip. But they offered me accommodation in this house, which was the observatory director's house, used to be. And the other amazing story here is this Boyden Observatory was set up by Harvard College Observatory when Harlow Shapley was the director, and Harlow Shapley actually ordered these trees to be planted, these big ones here. So Harlow Shapley's been in this area, but there's more. Here's the library of the Boyden Observatory, and I love old libraries, and this is just filled with history. One of the telescopes on this site used to be in Peru when Harvard used the Peru station for their southern hemisphere. And there was an astrograph that took photographs of the Magellanic Cloud, and they would ship the plates back by ship to Harvard. And those are the plates that Henrietta Leavitt used to discover the period luminosity relationship of Cepheid variable stars. And that telescope is now at Boyden Observatory. So as I say, there's a tremendous amount of history here, but there's more. The old observatory with the 28-inch refractor, which is now no longer in place, was used to take the first ever color photograph of Mars. It was in 1939. Earl Slipher, who was the brother of V.M. Slipher at Lowell Observatory. I won't go into the history of all this, but look them up sometime if you're not familiar with them. And a few years ago, the people at the Boyden Observatory found this wooden box with a brass tube in it. And it has a number 1 on it there. Well, they had photographs of old Slipher here using a camera to photograph Mars in the 1939, and it has a number 1 on the side. This was his camera. So they have the original camera that took the first color photograph of Mars. He did extensive observations of Mars with this telescope, and they're published in this book, which I have a copy of. And I'll come back to that. So this is another reason I wanted to be at Boyden Observatory to observe Mars, was some of the history of that site. This is the view overhead in a photograph. It's a 30-second, I think it's a 30-second or a 1-minute tracked shot, and I have not processed it. This is straight out of the camera. I thought, let me show you what the Milky Way looks like overhead when you just do a snap. This is why you go to the Southern Hemisphere. It is spectacular. And those of you know the Rho Ophiuchus star cloud is right here, and you're starting to see some of the color around Antares here. This is the telescope that I used. Yeah, not bad, huh? It's a 13-inch Clark refractor. And here's a shot I took pointing at Mars when it was still rising. And I just had this whole observatory to myself for a week. It was tricky to use. It's not electronically driven at all. It's a sector drive here and an extremely noisy electronics box that drives the sector drive. Here's a modern video camera attached to the telescope. And I was then told afterwards, this was the very first time a video camera had been attached to this telescope. Unbelievable. I don't know why somebody hadn't done it before, but they had not. Now, of course, you plan a trip to observe the perihelic opposition of Mars, and what happens? Mars gets a global dust storm, so you can't see anything. Oops. But I managed to pull something out. So here is one of my photos on July 8th using the 13-inch at Boyden. And you can see the polar cap. You can see some clouds on the limb here. You can just about see some dark markings. It took a heck of a lot to pull these features out. But I want you to compare to Earl Slipher's photographs made from Bloemfontein with the 28-inch, twice the size telescope. These were taken from Lowell in Flagstaff on the left. These are his photographs from South Africa in Bloemfontein, same location that I was at. So you see, we didn't do too badly. It was all right. And of course, Mars is coming around again. It's still tiny at the moment, but later this year, we're going to have a much better opposition from Northern Hemisphere observers. How am I doing on time? I guess We've been going 55 minutes, so I'll do another 5-7 minutes, and then we can ask if there are any questions or whatever.
Martin, yeah, it's Jerry here. Utterly enthralled. Thank you very much. Carry on until you've finished, and I'll take this opportunity to ask our chairman, John Talbot, to do your thanks at the end. But carry on. From
Yep. Okay. So yeah, just got a few more shots to show. So as I mentioned, my job in the planetarium world takes me lots of places, and one of the first places I ever visited as a kid, I came over to the U.S. To America on a personal trip in 1979 while I was still a member of Reading. It was a magnificent trip. I spent a month touring the Southwest observatories. I got up to Kitt Peak. That was wonderful. This is a photo I took for a more recent trip when I'd been working with the Armagh Planetarium, which is in Tucson, Arizona. So Armagh was one of the first planetariums I visited as a kid. And then as a professional, I end up presenting demos in that planetarium. So that was a treat. Here I am in 1979. I think those trousers are flares. Sorry about that. And this is a photograph I took outside. And I remember this photograph so vividly. And when I went back, I ended up meeting out of the planetarium a couple of people who ran the public observing program on Kitt Peak. And I said, oh, could I come up and use the telescope? And they said, sure. So I went, you know, the 20-year-old kid in me cannot believe his luck. But I asked the people to take a photograph of me to wave at my previous self. So here I am, 30 years later or something, waving at my my previous self who was standing over here. So one day I'll merge these two photos, but it's sort of just a personal funny thing to do. So here's the photographs, some of the photographs I took on the mountaintop. And this is a photograph of Comet Pan-STARRS in 2013 through a 4-inch refractor. It's a Takahashi, which is used for the public. But the other interesting thing is that is Uranus. I realized when I was writing about this comet, I noticed that it was going to be near Uranus on this night, but nobody would be able to see it because you can't see a 5th magnitude star 5 degrees off the horizon. But you can if you're at 7,000 feet in Kitt Peak Observatory. And then here's a couple of other snapshots through that 4-inch telescope. And I say snapshots, they really are, these are 30-second or 1-minute photographs. And the reason why you see much more is the altitude. You're 7,000 feet, you're above most of the haze in the atmosphere. And you just don't, all of this faint stuff that you can't detect down at sea level just comes through. And the same goes for comets. Comet tails are extremely hard to photograph from sea level or 200 or 300 meters elevation. But if you get to high elevation, that's where the really best photographs of comet tails are taken. Driving down the mountain, one of those nights, I saw the most incredible moon dog, which is like a sundog, but the moon is causing it. The brightest one I'd ever seen, right above the Wisconsin-Yale telescope. And this is Jupiter. And so I stopped the car and took a bunch of photographs, and I showed it to a few people down in Tucson, and they said, that's an astronomy picture of the day picture. So I sent it in, and it got posted December 11th, 2014. It's the only picture I've had on APOD. So that was a thrill. And okay, that's the end of the slides. So thank you very much for giving me this opportunity, folks. I will return the screen to seeing faces, and we'll leave it there. Thanks again for attending.
Well, thanks very much, Martin. That was absolutely fantastic for you to do that for us. And it's absolutely amazing to see upwards of 30 people present to see this. So Thanks very much, Martin, and a round of applause, everybody, please.
Yeah. Thank you very much.
And open up to questions. So anyone who wishes to ask a question, can you not talk over each other or raise your hand? Like, everyone hasn't got a camera, so you're just going to have to go for it, I think. Unmute yourself first.
Well, I haven't got a question, but I'll show you my other screen here. In 2017, I went to see an eclipse. And that picture is about 2 o'clock in the morning on the same night after the solar eclipse of the thunderstorm app on my tablet. And each one of those red dots is a recent lightning strike. The grey concentric circles are the clap of thunder radiating from each, and it goes in real time. This is just a still picture. Didn't see much of the eclipse, but saw some brilliant thunderstorms.
Yeah.
And that's Kansas City.
That's not far from here, and it's we get tremendous thunderstorms here. They're pretty dramatic. A little bit frightening sometimes.
It's one of my luckiest photographs ever. Was of a massive thunderstorm we had in Lower Early, where I photographed it from a back window. The DSLR I was using fell over and wouldn't take a picture. I picked up a pocket Canon camera, 10-second exposure, shoved it on a small tripod, and I caught a wave of lightning coming across the sky. Absolutely unbelievable and perfectly sharp. Just with this cheapest, most idiot camera I had laying about.
Mm-hmm. Amazing.
Just one of those moments.
I actually made some notes, Martin, while you were talking. The BAA centenary that you showed, it's on the Reading Astronomical Society's website somewhere, but we discovered that there was a Reading resident who was one of the founder members of the BAA, and the history and the location of his houses where he lived around the district. And it was all introduced to us by the Berkshire Records Office.
Oh, nice.
Mentioning Elstree School, I don't know if Anthony Thomas is with us at the moment, but we are planning to actually go back to Elstree School and use that same observatory again in the near future.
Oh, nice.
John and I went up there and, sorry Martin, John and I went up to Elstree and we looked at the site, which is rather overgrown now, I'm afraid.
Oh, okay.
But the school is busy chopping down the trees that are in the way, and they're going to have an observing patch beside the old observatory. But it's still there. The telescopes were still there.
Oh, good.
Yeah, it's all kind of come to a halt at the moment because of the current situation, but hopefully we can get that up and running again for members and for the schools.
Mm-hmm. Great.
So which was your favourite planetarium to work at then, Martin?
Oh, my. So that's so I think, I mean, what's happened in my, that's hard to answer. What's happened in my career with training people in planetariums, where I don't have to stay and do all the staff meetings and stuff. That's my favorite. And so I'm very lucky where I fly in, we prepare an opening show for a grand opening, and then I and perhaps another colleague present that show. And they are my favorite times. And probably it would be both planetariums we have in South Africa that are probably my favorites doing that. One is Bloemfontein. It was a very small group, but we had all of the local government people in that dome. So you're meeting ministers and the TV is there and everything's going. It's just a great celebration of astronomy. And to be a part of it is a real treat. But Cape Town was probably the biggest opening event. We had people traveling, professional people traveling, astronomers traveling from the US to be at that opening. We had they have pretty significant astronomy department at the university, and they're doing research on the large-scale structure of the universe. So they have these surveys that have the distribution of galaxies as you look out into deep space, and they can see the filaments, the filamentary structures. They can look at the chemical makeup of those galaxies as you look back in time, and you can fly along that and actually visually see the color-coded chemical makeup of galaxies as you go back in time. It's magnificent when you do it in 3D. And so we presented that show to some of the South Africa government ministers and 6 major universities, and just lots and lots of amazing, amazing people. And getting to do that is a real treat. One of the other places, and I could probably do a whole talk on the astronomy done at different sites where I've been, but one of them is Milagro in Argentina. And it's just across the Andes from Santiago. So anybody who went to Chile for the eclipse, it's a 1-hour flight from there. Well, to Milagro, to Mendoza. And then it's a 5-hour drive to Milagro, which is on a high plain. And they have the cosmic ray observatory detectors. It's an array of water tanks. And there's about 1,300 of them spread over hundreds of square miles. And what they do is detect particles.
Barry Kellett did a talk about that to the
Good.
society.
So you've heard a lot about it. Okay, good. So we have a planetarium there, and I went for the opening of the Auger Observatory, the Cosmic Ray Observatory, where they had the originators. They also had the IAU president and lots of other people. And so we gave them a planetarium show there with all of these astronomers visiting. So that was a memorable time as well. So I love, and one of my jobs in the planetarium world that I love doing is connecting to the local research astronomers and putting their research data into the dome so that you can talk to the public about it. I've always been a big proponent of taking research astronomy and making it palatable and interesting to a broader public, and that's what planetariums do.
Cool. Anyone else got any questions?
While we still got you, you were talking about the Slipher camera and the opposition of Mars. I'm gathering in the back of my mind now that Slipher and Lowell had different opinions about the quality of telescopes necessary to see details on Mars. Yeah,
they had quite a difference of opinion between the two of them. And of course, Earl Slipher outlived Percival Lowell by quite a few years. And I think somewhere one of the I can't remember the details of the talk, but Walt Disney interviewed Earl Slipher in the 1950s, and it's on YouTube somewhere. It's certainly worth going to look at for a little bit of historical perspective.
Because Lowell famously said that your telescope was too big to see details.
Yeah. Yeah. And, you know, some of what he was saying is relevant from the perspective of, if you think about the atmosphere as these little atmospheric cells, if your telescope is smaller than one of those cells, what you see is a wobbling of the image. But if your telescope is larger, you're taking in 2 or 3 or 4 of these cells, and so your image is garbled. And you can't reconstruct, and people who've done video of, you know, planetarium, lucky imaging of planets with a camera know this, right? If some nights it's just a mess, and you can't unravel the image. It's not coherent in the technical phrase. Whereas if your telescope is smaller than the cell above your telescope, the air cell that is wobbling, then you can unravel the image and get a decent image. So there is a certain rule of thumb to say, you know, a 9-inch telescope is possibly better at looking at features on planets than a 14-inch. On some nights.
Only on some nights, surely.
On some nights, yeah. And it all depends on what's above your head.
I heard Schleifer went down to the Andes to get better pictures, so maybe it didn't count.
Right.
There's a question on the chat, Martin.
Okay.
Was Jim Cronin one of the leaders of Monagro?
Yes, absolutely. Yeah, Jim Cronin was there. Now, sadly, not with us, but that's a good... Jim Cronin and... Who's the other guy? Forgotten his name. You know, I talked about things that I love doing, this connection with history and astronomy. So there's a cosmic ray book. I have it up on my shelf somewhere. It's one of the first books on cosmic ray astronomy, and I had Jim Cronin sign it at the opening of Auger. And so that's one of my kind of prized possessions. I have a lot of prized possessions in here. Let me scan. You can kind of, I mean, you all have rooms like this, right? I know Jerry does. So one or two books. We're all called hoarders, right? I mean, my wife smiled at me this morning when I came down, and I said, "Look, here's the copies of Rastar magazine from 1986."
Thank you.
So Patrick says he had Jim Cronin as his professor at the University of Chicago for several courses.
Really? Okay, great.
And he also asks, what was the angular size of Mars at that opposition, if you know it?
And the one that I went to?
Yeah, the one in South Africa, wasn't it?
I think it was 24. 24
That
hours
was the
second.
recent one, wasn't it?
Yeah. I'll just scoot. I think I may have noted it on my image, so I'll go and take a quick look at it.
So the ice caps of Mars are maybe 3 arc seconds across.
It's big this time too, later in the year.
Yeah. No, I didn't put the angular size on there, but I know it was at least 24 arc seconds.
Where is it positioned in the sky, Peter, this time?
Well, it's going to be quite good for us. It's going to be about 45 degrees when it gets to best, so it's going to be good this time round. But that's much later in the year.
Yeah, good.
I'm certainly looking forward to it with the 14-inch. I've got it all lined up, ready for it. Just a few months to go.
What got you into astronomy then, Martin?
A good question. So I think I vaguely remember Apollo 7. I really remember Apollo 8. And guess what? I still have the newspaper down here on the bookshelf from Apollo 8, of course, right? So by Apollo 8, so I was 9 years old. That was 1968. I was definitely hooked by the Apollo program. And there was, I don't know if any of you remember, there was a magazine called Countdown and Rocket. And I used to buy that. It was a mixture of science fiction and then Apollo spaceflight. And I kept a lot of pieces of those. And then they had a chart one time, a poster in the magazine, which is a 4-page unfolded thing. And I had that on my bedroom wall, and it showed the grand tour of the planets that were all going to happen within the next 10 years of my life. So I was thrilled. And of course, that didn't quite happen the way they'd envisaged. Pluto took a bit longer, but the Voyagers took over the Grand Tour idea and eventually got out to Uranus and Neptune. Another one of my lucky visits was when I was with the Armagh Planetarium. We got to go to the Jet Propulsion Lab during the Neptune encounter. And so that's where I started doing more of the sort of professional writing, reporting on that. We did some BBC radio for Northern Ireland during that flyby. And now I look back at it, and I mean, just a magnificent time in history to have experienced a major flyby where everybody is seeing things for the first time. But really, I lived in the north, going back to your question, I lived in northern England when I first started being interested in astronomy. It was a town called Gisborough, which is in Cleveland. And there was no one around who did astronomy in those days. There's quite an active group up there now. And so it was when I moved to Newbury and connected to Reading Astronomy Club that I really started learning stuff. Prior to that, I was just rambling around blindly, trying to find out, trying to learn things. And there's a lot of people in the Reading group that Jerry might remember, and Anthony, if he listens to the video, certainly will remember. As you know, I've mentioned some of them: John Trott, Jeff Amory. The Reading Club went on a trip to Commander Hatfield's observatory in Sevenoaks to see his spectrohelioscope. That was a memorable trip.
Yes, I remember.
Yeah, and that, I mean, those experiences really had a big impact on me. So I probably can't explain that enough to say, you know, the impact that the Reading Astronomy Club had on me was huge.
I think it was Jeff Amory that if you were sitting listening to a speaker, halfway, very, very quietly, he would creep down the room and whisper in your ear, would you like to do the thanks at the end of the speech?
Right.
Happened to me once.
And I will say, and I mean, I kept some of the reminiscences short, but there's a lot. One of my favorite personal stories was I did my first public lecture in the church room for Reading Astronomy Club when the junior members organized the entire meeting. So only junior members presented. One of the senior juniors, I think he was 17, did all the organization. And I was 14 or something, and I loved stellar evolution. So I decided I would give a talk on stellar evolution. So I did all this stuff, and there was a 9-year-old boy in the front row, and I said, okay, any questions? And he put his hand up, and he said, how do stars burn? And I said, that's a really good question. It's sort of a complicated answer, but here's how it goes. And I then progressed to illustrate the proton-proton chain reaction from memory. And I got an ovation for that. And I said, I like this. And I realized, and it was Anthony actually who told me a long time ago, he said, you would make a good teacher. And I went, whoa, really? I mean, Heather Cooper is the one who turned to me one time when I was at university, and he said, you can write. And coming from Heather Cooper, that was a true compliment. And I went, I can? Okay, I didn't think I could. So these little things all the way along the line really have impact on young people, and that's why I think it's great that astronomy clubs are around, and you can encourage youngsters to get into this stuff. And so,
yes, I agree. I get rather, well, not angry is not the word, but you get so many requests from people such as, what sort of telescope can I buy my son, and the various sort of studying aspects of astronomy. And I get very frustrated saying, look, we want to see you, come and see you, see a meeting, meet us, get to talk to people, because it is extremely informal. It's not a kind of thing where you can, it's not a sort of it's not a lonely occupation at all. If you just have a telescope and take pictures and look at them yourself and go through life without talking to other people about what you're doing, you're frankly wasting your time.
Well, you're missing out on a lot of experiences, and I think it's really good to, you know, I mean, it's one of the parts that I just love about astronomy is the people I've met, and it's taken me you know, all over the world. I mean, again, there are anecdotal stories, but my first trip to America in 1979, I wrote ahead to all the observatories and said, hey, I don't want the public tour that everybody else gets. I want a really detailed tour. And most of the observatories sent back their public information sheet. And Art Hoag, who was the director of Lowell Observatory, sent me a personal letter say, when you get to Flagstaff, give me a call. I will show you around. I mean, you know, blow the mind of a 20-year-old kid, right? And so I went and he showed me around, and I got to visit a 72-inch telescope where one of the astronomers was measuring double stars one night with him. And now, you know, things have come full circle. I know the current director of Lowell. He's on my Facebook, and I've told him this story. But Lowell is one of those places like Reading. It's one of those places that is close to my heart because they do the right things for helping people experience things in astronomy. And if you do that, then you're doing great, you know. So there's been a lot of that kind of experience. I'll give you one other anecdote, which I thought of adding in, and I never got the picture, but when I first got to Pittsburgh, we were creating our own planetarium shows. So this is the first time I'd been in charge of this. And so we created a show called Cosmic Perceptions, which was about how human perception influences our view of the universe. A little bit of psychology mixed in with astronomy, and it was a fun show to do. It turned out visually to be a very challenging show to put together because we were pushing the envelope as far as technology. This was before the days of full dome, but we were creating the appearance of a full dome show, even though we didn't have it. And so that show ended up being picked to be presented at an international planetarium conference in Florida. I think it was 1994. And that was around the time the London Planetarium was being refurbished. And the director of the London Planetarium, Undine Concannon, was at the conference. She saw the show and she said, I'd like that show to open the London Planetarium. Oh, okay. Wow. That was the first planetarium I visited as a kid. Again, here I am, having made a show for the opening. Once they got it installed, they invited us to the opening, and Stephen Hawking was there. So he's watching my show, and I get to go up and ask him. I said, so what did you like about the show? And he said, after a little pause, he said, my favorite part was the black holes. I said, good. Glad you liked it. So I have my photo with Stephen Hawking, which is fun. But I, you know, never lose. I mean, I do amateur astronomy all the time. I'm out in the backyard fiddling with computers and USB drivers, goodness knows what. Hard to give up.
Yeah. You're going to have to forgive me. I'm going to leave you shortly, Martin, because I want to go out to 2 telescopes and piers in the garden and computers. I want to fire them up. Right. But also, the computer I'm using for this is one of the computers I need on my telescope.
Priorities, Peter. You got to go do it. Totally understand.
I'm sorry, there are higher priorities, but it's been great, Martin. Really enjoyed it.
Well, it's been fun talking to you all as well. And I'm happy hanging around for a little bit more if you want as well, Jerry. So.
Yeah, it's just me going.
Okay.
It's a fantastically clear night again in the UK, and not a single contrail in the sky again.
Wow. It's just normal, right?
Yeah, the air is so clear, and yeah, haven't seen. I saw one contrail yesterday. It's the first one I've seen in a week.
When I lived in Pittsburgh, we had an average of 220 cloudy nights of the year. So I felt very much at home. And when I moved to Wichita, Wichita, we have 220 clear nights of the year.
Oh.
However, March is not one of the best. It's been pretty diabolical for February and March, but we've got a few nights out.
We've had a fantastic run here in the UK. It's been
Great.
All week has been sparkling clear. Yeah.
Yeah.
I remember you mentioned Anthony Thomas in Australia, because I actually remember Anthony Thomas doing talks about the night sky after he came back from Australia and was talking about that trip to us. And that was pretty inspiring. You know, I get down to the Southern Hemisphere as often as I can afford. And mainly because of what I remember Anthony Thomas telling us, you know.
Right.
I always wish I'd taken some photos of the sky when I was working in Zimbabwe.
Oh,
Back in the 90s, I was living in a village in the middle of nowhere. Skies you couldn't possibly believe.
Wow.
But I didn't have a camera back then. Unfortunately, it was early 90s.
Yeah, and so much has changed, hasn't it, John, in recent... I mean, I look back at some of my photos and I go, why did I even keep that one? And then you see what you can do today relatively easily, and then you start pushing that as far as you can as well. And there's so much dependent on the processing these days now as well to really make it stand out.
Yeah, it wasn't. It's a lot easier now with digital cameras, that's for sure.
Yeah.
So how many telescopes have you got there, Martin?
Oh, gee. Let me see if my wife's listening.
Isn't the number of telescopes n+1, where n is your current number of telescopes?
So my wife's wonderful. She helped me buy the 14-inch Celestron 14. I don't think she's just behind me, but she won't worry if I tell you the story that when I went to NEAF, which is the Northeastern Astronomy Forum, which would have been running this weekend had it not been for the virus. And she said, make sure you get a pretty one. You're going to be spending a lot of time with it. So I got the top best Celestron 14 Edge HD that I could. And I spent a lot of time with it. So, so I have, let's see, I think there's 7, might be 8, I don't know. So I have the 14 in the shed. I have a long time ago, well, I will tell you this. So when you move from England to the US, your first reaction as an amateur astronomer is the telescopes are half price.
Yes.
You almost can't really not buy one because it's ridiculous, and it's a pity that so much tax is marked up on such goods, because really as an educational tool they should not be taxed at that level. But that's a whole other can of worms. But this was back in the day when it was $2 to the pound as well, so it really was half price. So I bought an 11-inch Celestron, and a few years later I bought a CCD camera, which was an ST2000 XM, and a 4-inch Teleview, which was a used one. And that was a magnificent telescope. And my story since then has really been, I have seen through so many of my own not so optically perfect telescopes that I felt, you know, I need to have optically perfect telescopes. I need really good views. I've seen the fuzzy views. I want the really good views. And you also get to an age where you go, well, better do it now. You don't know. So, so I've started focusing on that, and that's why I bought the Stellarview. I needed a road telescope for eclipses, and I wanted top quality, and I bought the Stellarview, and that's a magnificent scope. The hard thing I'm trying to decide is it's about the same field of view as the 4-inch Teleview. So they're kind of matched. And I'm trying to think, do I sell the 4-inch Teleview? I don't know. That's a toughie. That's a difficult one. Hard to let a telescope go. I have a Coronado 90, which I haven't used a lot, but hopefully something will happen on the sun in the next 5 years and we'll be able to see some fun stuff. I have the 4-inch Cook. And then there's a whole project that I haven't told you about. I don't know whether I can share the screen on this. Remember I mentioned the Bradfield telescope, the 8-inch?
Yes.
Has anybody seen that recently? Probably not.
No.
So when I moved here in the 1990s, I thought, I wonder what happened to that telescope. I never checked. 2000s, I thought, oh, I wonder, because I spent most clear nights using that telescope. I have hundreds of hours on that telescope, and it was very dear to me. And I'm just going to try and pull up a photo, and by the time I do this, the picture will be ready. So, you know, another 10 years went by, and I went, you know, I really should find out what happened, and I didn't. And so another few years goes by, and something happened, I think it was about 3 years ago. I said, you know what? I should find out what happened to that telescope. So I got online, I found Bradfield College, I sent them an email, and I said, how's your telescope going? And they sent back, they said, oh, it's working really well. And they sent back a picture of a 16-inch Meade. Well, that was a shock. I said, what happened to the 8-inch? And they said, you won't believe this, but our maintenance crew are clearing out the maintenance yard, and they're about to throw this out. Can you see that?
Oh. Yeah.
That's what's left of it. So I was heartbroken. I went, oh my gosh. And he said, literally, we are a few days from throwing this in the dump. Because it hasn't been used for 15 years. Nobody's asked about it. Nobody's done anything about it. And I went, oh no. And isn't it odd in 30 years that the one day, the week that I asked the question is the week they found it and we're going to throw it out. If I'd have waited a week, this would have gone. And I said, what are you going to do with it? And he said, well, if you want to come pick it up, but it's going in the dump. And I said, I'll pick it up. I'll figure out a way. I have to rescue this. I have to rescue it. I said, by the way, can you tell me if there's any glass in this end? And he said, yeah, there is. I went, oh. This is an 8-inch lens. So I thought, what am I going to do? What do I do? Well, it turned out I had a business trip to the UK, and my parents are still there. And so when I landed, I rented a vehicle, and I put the pieces in the back of the vehicle, and that's all that's left. And I said, now what do I do? Because I fly back to the US in a week. What do I do? So some of you may know Moonraker telescopes. I called him and I said, I have this heavy metal stuff that is really dirty, and I need to figure out a way to keep it. And he said, well, I could box it up and ship it to you. And I said, how much will that cost? Well, it was the cost of a good 14-inch telescope. I said, do it. So it's in my garage. And this is a whole story that I could tell you, but I have spent a year and a half gradually cleaning that up. And maybe if I come back, I can tell you how it's going.
That'll be good.
And what would be great would be if one time, if it does, I'm treating it as a retirement project. And maybe one time, if it's all working, we can reinstate it somewhere at a public site. I consider myself a current custodian, and will make plans for it to be used in a public site eventually.
Okay, Martin, terrific. It's now a few minutes past the official time that we booked this session for.
Ah, yeah.
I'd like to say thank you very much indeed. I think you've probably got some lunch waiting. It's 2:30 where you are.
I managed to eat lunch early so that I wouldn't be fading out here. And I was going to ask if, since you're probably all on cocktail hour, is it too early for cocktails here? But I don't know.
Being English, I have a cup of tea. And my wife brought it to me just now.
Right.
Right, John, would you like to, as chairman, say thank you very much?
Yeah, yes, thanks again, Martin, for taking the time to do this for us. And thanks to Jerry for setting this all up so that we could get together when we're not going to be able to for a few months. And let's try and do another one in a month's time if we can.
Yeah.
It's good to see everybody. See you're all well, and keep safe and take care. And hopefully see you again soon. And Martin, thanks again for doing this for us.
So I'm on the show. I'm on a search for another speaker then, John. I'll let you know what we find. Thank you very much, Martin. It's been absolutely enthralling.
Thanks, Jerry. Thanks, John. And thank you, everybody, for
No, thank you.
hanging in this long.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Bye.
Bye.
Okay, bye-bye.
Bye.
Bye.